My name is M.Phil and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Politics here at NYU. And I'm going to be hosting today's lecture and discussion. And we are very happy to have Nigel Gould-Davies, who's an associate fellow of Chatham House and teaches at Mahidol University in Thailand. And he's also taught at Oxford University before joining the British Foreign Service. I should also mention that he's been an ambassador, British ambassador to Belarus for a while. And so he knows the area and he knows the content of the topic intrinsically very well. And the format is going to be that Nigel is going to talk for about 40 minutes. And then we will have a Q&A session for the remainder of the time. We should finish before 2 o'clock, so we have about 19 minutes for the entire conversation. Okay, so Nigel,
thank you very much. Thank you. Very good. Well, thank you very much on what I believe is the second day of your term, yes, your new semester, to come along. You're not too busy to attend this talk. I'm grateful for that. Nice to see that the global tradition of never sitting in the front row is not quite observed here. It's nice to have people rightly here. The origins of this talk here today go back in part to the fact that Josh Tucker and I were at graduate school together many, many years ago. And when I got in touch with him quite recently, he reminded me, it was a repressed memory on my part, I suppose I'd deliberately forgotten, he reminded me that we were both, among other things, on our government department basketball team called the Leviathans. Entirely appropriate in my case, as my basketball career was nasty, brutish and short. So anyway, maybe he'll say something about that too. He was a much better player than I was. So I'd like to offer some thoughts and pose a question for us to discuss today. I have some ideas about arguments I want to make about one particular set of important implications about sanctions, but I emphasize that this is a speculative line of inquiry, and I'd love the expertise in this room to share your thoughts and views about this. The subtitle of this talk is A Political Economy Under Strain, very much a question mark there. So again, no definitive final conclusion on my part. I welcome your views. A series of questions, really. The first that I'd like to pose is, what do the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since 2014, and especially since last year, I'll say more about that in a moment, what do they mean for those fabulously wealthy individuals that we have collectively come to know as oligarchs? It's a useful, if imperfect, term, of course, and roughly speaking, what I mean by that term today is that the oligarchs are those Russian business people who have acquired very, very significant fortunes, typically find them in the Forbes rich list, for example, not from leadership of state companies or not from direct attachment to state structures, but from privately owned wealth. Now, we know, of course, in Russia, it's always been the case that property rights have been more or less conditional, never vigorously and independently enforced. That's part of the tradition of the patrimonial state. And that therefore privately owned wealth is a more relative term than it might mean in some other countries. But just to fasten the distinction between oligarchs and, for example, silovarchs, as they're sometimes being called, the Silovia oligarchs, those with a security service background and by virtue of ties in that world have acquired very significant wealth. The oligarchs, we know them from their rise, and indeed from the terminology used to describe them as oligarchs from the early mid-1990s. So what do the sanctions specifically mean for them? What choices and challenges present themselves to the oligarchs as a consequence of these sanctions? Secondly, what choices, therefore, what options are available to oligarchs? They find themselves now in, I'd argue, unprecedentedly difficult circumstances in the sanctions world. It's not clear how they'll respond to that. I'll say a little bit about the potential options that face them a bit later. And thirdly, what might the implications of those choices be for Russia's longer-term development. The questions I want to address. Firstly, three broader points about the sanctions and sanctions regime that's been imposed by the West on Russia over the past 5 years, just to frame our inquiry into a broader context, and argue that these sanctions are exceptionally significant for three reasons. The first is that since 2014 we have seen, for the first time in the post-Cold War world, the decision by the West no longer to seek the integration of Russia into the global economy and global structures of economic governance, but rather to deprive Russia of some of the benefits of access to global trade flows and global investment. It's been a very sharp and decisive and distinctive turn in the whole Russian orientation towards, the Western orientation towards the Russian economy. Even as the Russian-Western relationship began to decline from the middle of the first decade of this century, from about 2004, 2005, even as the largest security relationship began to decline, the West's enthusiasm to integrate Russia economically continued undimmed. And we saw increasingly a tension or even a contradiction between a darkening political and security relationship and still the bright, buoyant confidence that it would be a good and mutually beneficial thing to integrate Russia into global structures of global governance. Hence, for example, after the longest accession process in history, Russia's entry into the WTO early in the following decade. And I was sitting in Moscow observing this process. I was heading the economic section at the time, and our country's relationships were getting much more difficult with Russia, and we in the embassy personally were metaphorically and occasionally literally beaten up by the deteriorating relationship. And yet at the same time, there I was hosting visits by the Lord Mayor of the City of London and Western business people and so on, encouraging, hosting road shows to encourage listings on London Stock Exchange and so on. It was a curious sort of tension. What we've seen since 2014, since the imposition of sanctions, is, if you like, a resetting of the different elements of this relationship into a much more consistent pattern. Not only the political and security elements, but the economic dimension of the relationship, all fitting together as essentially adversarial in nature. I go even further than this and say that the sanctions era that we now find ourselves in marks the first time in the entire history of the Russian, Soviet and Western relationship where the major constraint on the economic relationship has come from the West rather than from Russia, or in its previous incarnation, the Soviet Union. So, for example, it's certainly true that in the Soviet era, during the Cold War, the West did apply various forms of sanction on the Soviet Union. But they were relatively minor, specific and quite limited constraints and limitations compared to the much more fundamental constraints on the possibilities of that relationship imposed by the fact that the Soviet Union was a state socialist system that fundamentally did not believe in and was ideologically opposed to a significant degree of integration with a hostile, as it saw it, global capitalist system. The constraints came much more from the Soviet side than the Western side. So in that larger historical perspective, the West has really never sought to deprive Russia of the benefits of access to the global economy as vigorously as it's doing now. If one wanted to go further back into history, before the Russian Revolution, of course, an awful lot of Western capital was flowing into Russia and helping to fuel the late Tsarist era industrialization. So in that larger perspective, these sanctions mark a genuine and significant break from all previous traditions of the Western management of that relationship. The second distinctive and significant feature of these sanctions is, of course, their effects on Russia. And I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. But in essence, for Russia, these sanctions mark a significant adverse economic shock, economic and political shock, upsetting and undermining Russia's attempts under Putin to manage Russia's economic relationships with the West, both to make Russia richer, but also to fashion instruments of influence that Russia has sought to use in its relationships with the West, especially in respect of managing the energy relationship, but also some trading relationships as well. Russia has sought simultaneously to become richer and more politically influential as a result of its external economic orientation. It's deprived of that possibility now, at least very substantially. What instead we have is the West using instruments in turn of economic influence to try to change Russia's behavior. So it's an unwelcome adverse development for Russia. And thirdly, the sanctions that the West is imposing on Russia are significant in the history of sanctions themselves. It's only really since the early 20th century that economic sanctions as a consciously thought through, significant and distinctive instrument of foreign policy have been developed. We've seen evolution in the use of sanctions over time and place since then. And their use against Russia marks the first time that an economy of this relative size and significance in the global economy has been subject to major sanctions. So Russia is a uniquely challenging target for sanctions, and we've seen significant innovation in sanctions practice by the West to try to target this unique challenge for sanctions. You can say more about that if you're interested. One particular detail, what we are beginning to see now, is types of sanctions previously applied only to non-state groups, either terrorist organizations or criminal groups, or so-called rogue states like Iran and North Korea, relatively small targets being applied for the first time to a very, very big target, especially some of the more sophisticated financial sanctions. So for those big three reasons, what we are seeing now is a very, very significant event in international relations as such. It's important in the history of Russian-Western relations, in Russia's own development, and in the history of sanctions themselves. So if you're interested in international relations, if you're interested in Russia at all, you have to be interested in understanding these sanctions. Now, it's clear already that the sanctions that have been imposed are hurting Russia and causing a growing degree of concern and alarm within the state, among elites and among the population itself. Just to give you one illustration, senior figures, senior officials whose views rarely coincide on any significant issue share this concern. So Alexei Kudrin, for example, the very influential former finance minister, now head of the audit chamber, is expressing repeated, very public concern about the consequences of sanctions. And Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, a senior silovik, someone whose views on most issues, his entire worldview, very different from Kudrin's, has also expressed his concern about the accumulating effects of sanctions on, for example, the prospects for Russia's energy sector. A deep concern from very different perspectives about the impact of sanctions. How will these sanctions work? Sanctions are a means. The end, of course, is to change or influence current or future Russian policy. How will that work exactly? Sometimes this question is posed in the following way. How far will sanctions hurt the Russian population and therefore encourage a large number of ordinary people to mobilize and demand political change from below? I think that's the wrong way to think about sanctions for two reasons. One is that that is not how the sanctions are designed to work. They are smarter than that. Their purpose is not to cause widespread economic suffering among, as it were, a large number of small people. That's not their goal. They're targeted in much more precise ways. That concept of sanctions as a blunt instrument to hurt an entire country, that is not consistent with the broader evolution of sanctions practice in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's certainly not how they are intended to apply to Russia. The second reason why that's not the right way to think about sanctions effects is that in any case, change generally happens from within regimes rather than from below. And this has been emphatically the case repeatedly across post-Soviet space since the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the successor states. The key text, for those of you who've either read this or are interested in it, as I would see it, is Henry Hale's book, Tectonic Politics, a really important and very significant piece of work, in a sense, the distillation of many years of his scholarship. Tectonic Politics makes the argument that across every state of the post-Soviet post-Soviet space where significant change has taken place, it's always taken place when elites have defected from a leader, when elites have reached the conclusion that the leader, who until that point appeared very strong and dominant, can no longer protect their interests effectively. And as a consequence of that, very quickly, a country can find itself in a situation where an apparently strong and stable regime can weaken and disintegrate, indeed replace its leader, or even more than its leader. Repeatedly, Henry, who Josh knows as well, of course, we were all in the same government department together, has shown how this pattern has repeated itself across many different countries in the wider region. So change is driven by, and especially initiated by, defection by elites. So if you want to look at change or prospects for change in Russia, look at how elites are thinking. Look at the incentives that face them. Look at the opportunities that they have to turn their preferences into policies of change that protect their interests more effectively than the status quo. And that's how I want us to begin to think about the effects of these sanctions that the West is now imposing on Russia. So the question is, in what ways will sanctions affect elite interests, and in this case specifically the interests of the oligarchs, and not the only elites of course, and how will the oligarchs themselves, respond to the choices and dilemmas that face them. Make a further point too about how we think about oligarchs. So you'll recall that in the early, mid and late 1990s, when the oligarchs rose to prominence and their influence was very clear, the oligarchs were a source of fascination. Many studies about them, many books about them, they're followed very closely. And understandably so. Their position and their influence were very clear. They financed political parties, they owned significant media outlets, their voices in the court of Boris were very, very clear. They even in some cases occupied formal positions in hierarchies of power. Berezovsky, for example, was for a time the deputy head of the Security Council. So they were very visible, their influence was very clear, they were an essential element of the informal constitution of power. Now, as we know, with a speed that surprised everyone, including oligarchs themselves, they were brought to heel early in the 2000s. In the course of Putin's first term, they, and the regional governors, who are also key parts of the informal constitution of power, were cowed and intimidated and brought low by a resurgent Russian state, so-called vertical of power rebuilt by the new vigorous and determined president. Oligarchs ceased to have the visible and significant power that they'd enjoyed before, and as a consequence of that, ceased to be an object of sustained study. There's been far less work done to try to understand the oligarchs, what they think, what their interests are, since the early 2000s than before. Now then, that change happened very quickly. And of course, we all remember the case of the Yukos affair and what happened to Khodorkovsky when he resisted these trends. Yes, he became an object lesson. What happens if you try to resist or challenge the vertical? That change happened very quickly. Again, faster than anyone expected, faster than the oligarchs expected. Is it forever? We saw the rapid decline of oligarchic power. Is that a decisive and unchangeable future fact about Russia's evolution? Or, pose the question, could circumstances emerge again for the rise or resurgence of oligarch power? It's worth asking. It's worth asking whether this unexpected decline in their power is something that could never be reversed. So that's another reason to at least pose the question about the potential of the oligarchs and the role that they might play in the future. Now, the sanctions that the West has imposed since 2014 have been ratcheted up as far as the oligarchs are concerned last year. 2018 saw a number of very significant measures taken by the United States and the European Union that for the first time were targeted at the major owners of private wealth. To give the two most significant examples, not the only ones, but the most significant, in April we saw the United States use its financial power to largely cut off Oleg Deripaska from access to global financial markets. Very, very severe and significant use of sanctions in response to a pattern of malign activity around the world, which is the US Treasury's wording for the justification for this sanction. Viktor Vekselberg was also to some extent affected as well. But of course the significance of these actions went much wider than their impact on the directly targeted individuals, because it was quite clear that other very wealthy private business people in Russia knew that they could also be targeted. There's no assurance that those sanctions, and there's still no assurance now, that such sanctions will not be applied more widely or to other targets in the future. So the demonstration effect of these targeted actions was disproportionate to their impact on the individuals involved. So those April financial sanctions are formidable wielding of American power, including the threat of secondary sanctions on others, anyone else in the world that sought to do business with them. Very, very significant. The second of the two most important developments, adverse developments, as part of as far as the oligarchs are concerned, was the series of reappraisals in the EU in particular of oligarch wealth, and indeed of the presence of oligarchs themselves, in the wake of the Salisbury nerve agent attack. We've seen in Britain in the first instance, but also other countries beginning to follow suit now, a more searching and critical scrutiny of the sources of foreign wealth, not only Russian, but in particular Russian wealth, flowing into Western countries to seek protection. And indeed, not just the wealth, but the individuals. So you'll be aware of the case, again, symbolically significant, out of all proportion to the details of the case, Roman Abramovich. In the late 90s, very influential, but had kept a low profile at that time. Indeed, I recall one of the Russian newspapers, I think it was Kommersant, some circa 1997, 1998, actually offering a prize for anyone who had a photograph of Abramovich, because he's much spoken of, but no one was really sure what he far as the general public went, pretty shorty looking. And he was the one, of course, who, in a dramatic departure from his previous low profile, had gone out and bought Chelsea Football Club, instantly become a celebrity in the West. An innovation, a strategy imitated by some, but not all, of the oligarchs. So he was an early adopter, so to speak, of Western publicity. So therefore, very significant that it was he who last year, was faced difficulties renewing his investor visa, a long-standing resident in the United Kingdom. He found it hard to renew his visa, kept waiting. Eventually, in order to get back into Britain, he took out Israeli citizenship, enabled him to do that. But again, the point had been made, and other people like Abramovich saw that the point had been made. So again, a clear signal that higher standards of scrutiny, a more critical attitude towards foreign wealth is now being adopted. So those two developments begin to shift the set of opportunities that oligarchs face. And why is that so important to them? Let's look back at the recent history of the oligarchs. Their sudden decline in influence in the early 2000s, during the first Putin term. The oligarchs found themselves in a far less powerful, indeed now subordinate position within Russia. One of the ways they responded to that new and adverse situation in Russia was to seek security and protection for their assets, to some extent for their families and even for themselves, overseas. So a new bargain, in effect, was struck, a sort of regulatory arbitrage, whereby these figures, by virtue of their connections within Russia, a rule of relationships, made and sustained a great deal of money, and kept that safe and protected where the rule of law ran. So the rule of relationships and the rule of law. You make money here and you keep it safe there. That was a key element of the oligarchic response, which helped reconcile them to the new order, the new form of political economy that Putin was determined to build. One can think of it as outsourcing a part of the protection of assets that they're no longer confident that they could enjoy within Russia. So the oligarchs, as it were, made their peace with the new Putin dispensation, in part by deepening their involvement with Western systems, where they could use and enjoy the protection of laws independently and non-politically enforced. That gave them an element of security. What was the Russian state? What was Putin's attitude towards that? For much of this period, the Russian state tolerated that and even found uses for it. These oligarchs, recall, remained subordinate within Russia. They had to ask for the Russian state's permission to, for example, make major investments overseas, to list on the London Stock Exchange. From time to time, the Kremlin found uses for these oligarchs and helping to burnish Russia's reputation and even its influence overseas. So a bargain of that kind was struck between the oligarchs and the Russian state. The third set of interests involved in this emerging web of relationships were the beneficiaries in the West of this new and thickening and deepening relationship the oligarchs sought. In particular, elements of the financial sector, the property sector, and the public relations sector, all involved in improving Russian oligarchs' reputations, helping to secure a position of respectability overseas in the West that would help support their ultimate objective of long-term asset protection. So you see a series of alignments here. The alignments of the oligarchs seeking protection, the interests of the Russian state, seeking to use that for its own purposes in various respects, and the interests of the, you call them oligarch valet services, servicing the interests of the oligarchs in Western countries. Often well-connected sectors, the financial sector, especially a country like Britain, disproportionate political influence, argue quietly against any attempt to hold foreign wealth to higher standards of account, especially before 2008, when the ideology, as it were, of hyper-globalization, which I felt very keenly from my little place in Moscow Embassy, that was really the reigning view. The more financial transactions we can make with Russians, wealthy Russians in particular, the better. So it's a set of bargains and alignments that emerged in response, on an international scale, in response to the now subordinate position of the oligarchs within Russia. There were, even at the height of this arrangement, there were tensions that sometimes arose between the different interested parties. So, for example, in 2012, when Putin returned to the presidency, having been prime minister for 4 years, he began to take a darker view of globalization. Hitherto, he'd seen it as something usable and supporting the larger projection of Russian influence. And it's clear that the calculus of his calculations began to shift in the direction of seeing this as a source of threats as well as of opportunities. And this manifested itself in a new set of demands to the oligarchs. He began at that point, from 2012, to say, look, bring your money back to Russia. De-offshorization was the slogan that began to be heard. He demanded that. The oligarch, yes?
Why did he become so negative towards globalization?
He began, okay, so two elements to an answer there. The first would be, in respect of the oligarchs specifically, he wanted them to bring back money, partly because he wanted to see this invested within Russia itself, but also, more fundamentally, I think more significantly, he began to worry about the future direction of oligarch loyalties, to the extent that they got more deeply tangled in Western systems of the rule of law. Could he be confident that he was able to control them, that they would continue ultimately to answer to him and to the Kremlin? And those of you familiar with the name Alexander Dugin, this right-wing, conspiratorially minded, how one describes him, a writer, a thinker, a philosopher of Eurasianism. We know who we mean by him. He wrote a significant and influential article about this time, Shestaya Kolonna, it's called. It appeared in the newspaper Vzglyad. And he referred to this phenomenon, he coined this term, the sixth column. So what do you mean by that? Remember what the fifth column is, right? Back to the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish generals have four columns marching on Madrid. The fifth column is within. It's those who are actually fighting for us, supporting us, but nominally in enemy territory. The sixth column, the Dugin innovation, was to say, well, we have these people, oligarchs, they are overtly loyal to us, and they will miss no public opportunity to sort of emphasize that, but really their underlying interests are pulling them elsewhere in other directions. So the sixth column. Yes. Also, just to complete an answer to your question, why more generally did I've already mentioned the Leviathans.
Okay.
More generally, I think that around this time Putin began to see the EU's attraction by virtue, more than anything, of its economic influence as a potential threat to Russia's desire to consolidate control over what is still sometimes called the near abroad. We saw that tussle between different poles of economic attraction manifests itself dramatically in Ukraine in the course of the events of 2013 2014. Is that clear? Does that address your question? Good. So that was the first tension, that even in the height of these fairly stable and vigorous alignments between these three interests, the oligarchic interest in security, the Russian state interest in influence overseas, and the Western, the oligarch valet services in the West, that had sort of solidified in the early part of the last decade. Even at their height, we saw these tensions. The significance of Putin's call from 2012 to begin to de-offshore lies in the fact that the oligarchs quietly ignored that. They did not comply. And that shows us two things. The first is how important it was, it's a core fundamental oligarchic interest to retain access to rule of law systems overseas, where its assets could be kept safe, and at a safe distance in particular from any threat posed by the Russian state. An interest so core and so fundamental, it's worth defying Putin himself. And the second significant fact about this episode is that the oligarchs were successful in doing that. This was an issue of fundamental interest to them, where they're able to do something different from what Putin wished. And this begins to challenge any general and simple assumption that the oligarchs simply had been cowed and subordinated and had to do, in every important respect, the bidding of the Kremlin. It's more complicated than that. The Putin dispensation is more variable, perhaps less stable, than a simple hierarchy of power vertical over the oligarchs. They wished to, and they were able to, resist Putin's call for de-offshorization. There were other tensions as well in these arrangements, and in particular in the West, as the security relationship and political relationship became increasingly difficult, especially after the Georgian events, for example. There were debates that became more active within the West between those who continued to wish to welcome Russia's integration to the global economy and those that increasingly saw the security risks and threats of doing that. So globalization versus, as it were, realism, with a capital R, as rival ways of thinking about how to manage the West's relationship with the Russian economy. But overall, these alignments that I described remained fairly intact and largely unfrayed and unchallenged. Gave rise to two paradoxes. The first is that the oligarchs became much, much richer, even as they lost influence and power within Russia itself. And the second paradox is that Russia became more adversarial in its relationship with the West, and yet a key part of its elite became more dependent on the West simultaneously. There's something interesting and paradoxical going on there. Now, the sanctions regime since 2014, and especially the key elements of the sanctions regime that I described earlier, introduced in 2018, have for the first time targeted elite interests and oligarchic interests in particular, and have produced a significant and adverse impact on oligarchic interests. The oligarchs now feel themselves to be less secure and less welcome in the West. Again, if Abramovich can be effectively deprived of investor visa, then anyone can. So, for the first time, this stabilizing bargain that has helped reconcile the oligarchs to the Putin dispensation, the ability to store assets, sometimes their families, safely in the West, that is now under threat. It's a new and unwelcome situation for them. But things have got worse for the oligarchs than just that. We've also seen in the past year, especially the past few months, new demands within Russia being made on the oligarchs by the Russian state. Demands for greater investments by the oligarchs, demands for tax increases as well. Going a little further back, we've seen bad things happen to wealthy Russian figures. Yevtushenko, for example, Magomedov as well, and although he was a minister rather than an oligarch, Milyukayev too, in effect at the hands of Sechin. So there's much here to cause growing consternation and worry within Russia for the oligarchs as well. So less secure and welcome in the West, under growing pressure within Russia and from the Russian state too. What's left? Social support, societal popularity? No, that's really never existed at all. The oligarchs remain broadly unpopular figures. If there's any doubt of that, those who follow Alexei Navalny on Twitter will have seen last November a very, very fierce condemnation that he issued against some remarks that Chubais had made. Chubais had come out in a public speech and said, Russians are too ungrateful to the oligarchs. Look what they achieved in the 1990s. And Navalny just tore into him. And so there's a significant moment. The most popular, formidable opposition figure, clearly, even now, very explicitly critical of the oligarchs. So pity the lonely oligarch. Wherever they turn, they're unpopular. In the West, Russian state and Russian society. This is very curious and intriguing, because of course they remain very, very wealthy. And we know how concentrated wealth is in Russia. And yet somehow that enormous wealth has not proved fungible, has not proved convertible either into political influence or social legitimacy. In wider comparative perspective, I think there's an interesting puzzle there. How is it that enormous material resources have not enabled them to become more broadly popular, confident, accepted, or influential? If anything, at least until recently, they were more able to turn their wealth into legitimacy and reputation in the West than in Russia itself. So something intriguing. Just to finish up then, where does this leave the oligarchs today? What are the choices that face them in responding to what is an unprecedentedly constrained and distressing situation for them? And argue that there are really four choices that we can think of. The first is to respond to the declining welcome in the West by throwing all their baskets, all their eggs, or most of their eggs, back into the Russian basket, to heed Putin's call, which is made again, of course, to de-offshore and return themselves to Russia, hope that they can strike some new and satisfactory bargain in a Russia that is, in its own terms, becoming a more difficult place to operate. So choose between the West and Russia by choosing Russia. That carries its obvious risks. The second option would be to do the opposite and to choose the West. Cut ties with Russia, try to eke out remaining years and decades in a gilded nest somewhere in a Western country. Even supposing they were able to do that and to be accepted in the West on those terms, that rarely happens. In fact, if you look at economic elite behavior around the world, it's very rare in significant numbers for elites to behave that way. It requires cutting ties with the culture and the networks and all the things important for identity that have sustained them until then. A good source on this, if you're interested, Elizabeth Schimpfossel's excellent book, Rich Russians, wonderful sort of sociological study about how oligarchs have tried to reinvent themselves as a new bourgeoisie, accepted within Russia, but especially overseas. She makes this broader global point about elite economic behavior. They very rarely become exiles of their own country in large numbers. The third choice would be to avoid choosing. Oligarchs in this scenario would simply keep their heads down, hope that the trouble goes away, hope that somehow they can muddle through, that the drift and direction of events would somehow move in such a way as to create in due course a more tolerable alternative. So as to avoid choosing just to be as quiet as possible, hope that things don't get too much worse. The last of the four choices, and the most intriguing one, potentially, for Russia's future, would be to try to now seek to use their vast material wealth and connections within Russia to begin to effect some form of change, to seek to better protect their own core interests by shifting, moving, nudging Russia's political economy in a new direction. How that works exactly is not clear, probably not clear to them. But I'd be very surprised, personally, at least some of the oligarchs are not now asking themselves this question. And we, against the background of a deteriorating reality, both overseas and within Russia, what must they do to try to change circumstances within Russia to better protect their own long-term prospects? The potential for doing so is clearly increasing as the swirling uncertainty of the 2024 question approaches. The question of what will happen to the presidency once Putin's current presidential term comes to an end. That looming shadow is getting darker and bigger every day, influencing the ways that people think about a whole range of questions regarding developments within Russia and in respect of the oligarchic potential uses of their wealth and connections. They must surely at least be thinking in these terms. Now, it's easy to think of reasons why it might be difficult or impossible for the oligarchs to use their fortunes and their connections to drive some form of change in Russia, even if that's what they wish to do. One reason is that it's very hard for them to mobilize support from below. And for those who have read Henry's wonderful book, Tectonic Politics, that I referred to earlier, Henry Hale, a part of the logic of sudden changes of regimes in the post-Soviet space has been the defection of elites from leaders and then their mobilization of support below. We sometimes like to think of change being affected by, driven by brave masses, yes? According to this story, everything important happens from above. And the masses who mobilize in protest are objects more than subjects. They are induced or created by elites with resources in getting them to do the things that the elites want. Harder in Russia to do that, because the oligarchs are so obviously unpopular. That's one reason why it might be hard for the oligarchs to turn their wealth into influence to change. The second reason is that the oligarchs, or some critical mass of them, would have to concert their actions, would have to agree on what to do and how to do it. And they are notoriously, or have proven in the past, notoriously difficult to work together. At the height of their influence, in the mid and late 1990s, they're at war with one another. What's called the so-called bankers' wars, the rival uses of different media outlets to smear each other's reputations, the ferocity of the court politics around Yeltsin. They were certainly not united there. In the sense they didn't hang together, and therefore they were soon to hang apart in the next decade. In these much more adverse circumstances in which they find themselves now, would they find it easier to agree broadly on a set of actions on a direction ahead? Not clear. The third and final reason why it might be very difficult for the oligarchs to seek to influence the status quo in Russia in a way that would better serve their interests is that they now, at this point, may simply be too weak. Maybe it is the case that that drastic decline in their influence in the early part of the last decade is, in fact, forever, or at least for the long term, and that other actors different from them are simply stronger. The state is stronger, the oligarchs are stronger as well. So the oligarchs are simply, despite their great fortunes, simply unable to command the resources, and particularly the hard resources of potential force needed to back up or to initiate change. On the other hand, it is exceptionally unusual in any country in the world for those with large private fortunes not to influence politics in ways that serve their interests. Exceptionally unusual for holders of great wealth to find their interest systematically overridden by others. If Russia does turn out to be a country like that, then it's an interesting outlier. Against the larger background of the study of comparative politics, it's a striking exception that requires explanation. Or it might be the case that in due course the oligarchs do find a way to make their wealth fungible, to turn it into other valued resources that help them do the things that they wish to. Let's remind ourselves finally that Russia is a place that really has been full of surprises over the past 4 decades. It's very difficult to think of a country, any country, that has gone through as much variation in its patterns of governance over the last 4 decades as Russia has. Think back to the grim early 1980s, Andropovian late Soviet Union. A grim and hard place. Move forward just a few years to Gorbachev's reforms, to perestroika and glasnost, then a little more forward to the entire disintegration both of system and of state. Look at the evolution, the roiling chaos of the Yeltsin years, and then the sudden shift, again, faster than anyone expected, in the early 2000s under Putin. What appears to be, the narratives of Russia are a hard, strong state. The reality is it's brittleness rather than strength. It's brittleness rather than strength because Russia is under-institutionalized. There is very little sustaining ballast that limits the range of variation of change in governance. So if one looks no further back than even the past 4 decades at how much has changed, how often, do we have any reason for thinking that that fluidity and those possibilities for change have ceased to exist in the future? So I leave that as a final speculation. And just a couple of conclusions then to try to tie all this together. The first conclusion is that the oligarchs now find themselves in an unprecedentedly difficult situation as a consequence of sanctions. They are more incentivized than ever to respond to that, potentially to begin to affect change. They have difficult choices, but one possibility is that they might now wish to become more active in the political economy at any time since the late 1990s. Secondly, this question is becoming more important as the shadow of 2024 increasingly looms. And third, this may be ultimately Russia's weakness. So there is an argument that the 21st century, or this part of it, will be defined not so much by the balance of power, but by the balance of resilience, which societies are better able to withstand the challenges of global change, including those specifically presented by adversaries. We have seen in the case of the West the apparent weaknesses in open society being manipulated by electronic means, by social media, at a mass level by other countries, notably Russia. Maybe Russia's weakness, maybe its lack of resilience, does not come in that form, in the form of mass manipulation, but rather in the fracturing of its elites, and especially its economic elite. And with that conclusion, let me stop talking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions and observations about the tentative, and again I emphasize speculative arguments that I've tried to offer today. Thank you.
So thank you, Nigel, for what I thought was very illuminating analysis. So let's open the floor for questions. If you could just briefly introduce yourselves before asking the question. Okay, so I'll ask the first question just to warm things up. So the standard, my understanding of sort of the model that people have in mind when they talk about sanctions and Russia post Crimea is that, well, it will somehow incentivize the oligarchs to put pressure on Putin. That's the idea, right? You make them sort of run harder. You make their economic situation more difficult, and that's going to create pressures inside the regime. But what I do not understand in this sort of reasoning is that, well, if sanctions are really related to Crimea, right? There is no way out of it. Crimea, for all practical political purposes, is sort of a gone thing. There's no way that there's going to be a new political leader in Russia who's going to turn back and say, hey, you know, now in order to get rid of these sanctions, let me give back, you know, the peninsula. It's just not going to happen. So, in some sense, it's not even surprising that there is no visible pressure inside Kremlin, right, or inside the ruling regime of Russia for any sort of political change, because there's no eventuality in which the sanctions could be reversed for the reason that they were put in place in the first place. So what's your take on this particular, what I think is sort of a bit of a gambit situation?
Okay, so at this point, 5 years after Crimea, a large number of different kinds of sanctions have been imposed for a range of different reasons on Russia. The first, absolutely right, that was in response to Crimea. Those sanctions I do not see as having been intended to motivate or incentivize oligarchs to pressure or bring about change in Russia. They were quite specifically directed much more at the political and bureaucratic and military and administrative elite. Those who occupy state structures seen as complicit in or responsible for the annexation of Crimea. I think if we're looking at the potential impact of sanctions on oligarch calculations, the calculation of the owners of great private wealth, what we're really looking at is those introduced last year, much more recent. Yes. So the April financial sanctions I referred to. Narrowly targeted in the first instance, but again the demonstration effect is very clear. They all know that they could potentially be next. And if there's any doubt on that, then the so-called Kremlin file, published by the Treasury last January, basically a year ago, as you know, essentially appeared to cut and paste the entire fourth rich list into those seen as having benefiting from the regime. So that's a kind of sword of Damocles that's sort of hanging over them all. Plus the post-Salisbury imposition of higher standards by European countries. Those are much more recent developments. Those are the ones that we need to focus on if we're looking at sanctions designed to affect oligarchic calculations. So there's that point, but also the other point now that sanctions are not only motivated by, as a response to the annexation of Crimea. It's much more now what has happened since in eastern Ukraine, and even more widely than that, more ambiguously, if you will, this sense of an accumulating series of Russian actions, including intervention in Syria, that's been referred to, the Salisbury invasion attack and so on, bundled up into this formula a pattern of malign activity around the world. So it's become much more general, much more comprehensive. It's no longer clear, actually, and I think this gets at the essence of part of your question, it's no longer clear what Russia now could do to bring about the lifting of sanctions, even if it were to retreat from, give back Crimea. Under present management, it does not seem a possibility. Even if they were to cite another early condition for sanctions lifting, if they were to fully implement the Minsk II Accords, even if those things were to happen, again, it seems zero chance for either of them. Sanctions are used so broadly now, attached to this much wider ambiguous formula. It's sanctions have become a condition of the relationship, of the defining feature of the relationship, rather than a particular instrument now that could be lifted under a series of definable conditions. And that is felt and understood, I think, very clearly in Russia now, when people, including oligarchic figures, Putins himself gave an interview just a few weeks ago which made this very point. He said, no, sanctions aren't going, sanctions are here for the longer term. They're not going to go away at all. A number of points there. It's not just about Crimea. The oligarch specific sanctions are very recent. Their effects are only beginning to be felt. Could they, in due course, lead to outcome, policy effect of bringing about changes in Russia? Well, that was the larger theme of my talk. That was the issue I was trying to dissect. And again, I emphasize it's a question of that answer. I'm not saying they will. I'm saying it's important to look at that question and examine it from all sides carefully. But it's too soon, in any case, to pass judgment on it. And there seems to be, more generally, in discussions about sanctions, a sort of impatience which rarely attends discussions of other kinds of policy instruments. Occasionally we hear these, as I see it, either rather lazy formulations. Sanctions haven't worked, therefore let's lift them. We don't hear war doesn't work, or international aid doesn't work, for example. So it would be wrong to demand higher, more exacting standards for assessing the efficacy of sanctions than we apply to comparable policies.
So I'm Jorge, I'm a Ph.D. student in the Department of Politics, and I have two related questions. So the first is about the four futures that you were talking about. And all four of them, basically Putin gets the advantage. Either the elites go back to Russia and invest solely in Russia, or they try to work together, but that's probably not going to happen because of the reasons that you cited. So shouldn't the West, wanting to destabilize Russia and wanting policy change, shouldn't they actually do the reverse, and instead of sanctioning certain individuals, welcome other individuals within Russia to integrate more to the West and therefore fracture the elites in Russia? So that's the first question. The second question is, how do these economic sanctions impact the public's view of Putin? How does that impact Putin's popularity among the masses? Are the economic sanctions impacting the general economy to the point that normal people are not liking Putin as much? Because that could be a mechanism to drive policy change.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Okay, so on the first question, welcome the oligarchs more. So how would that differ from the status quo, from the situation that existed before sanctions were imposed, when oligarchs did enjoy, and their private wealth, enjoyed generous, largely unlimited access to the West's rule of law and the protection of it. And it wasn't just it wasn't just the rule of law. I mean, it took very interesting forms. It was Western legal systems as well. So deals, agreements struck between oligarchs under UK law, under English law, disputes between them being resolved in London law courts. Yes, there's a whole set of, again, oligarch services provided by a range of Western sectors. And the oligarch preference was to use these rather than Russia's own systems, so to speak. So just easier, better, more secure to do things that way. Those are the times and those are the circumstances in which the oligarchs were welcomed in the West. They did not fracture. They were very happy with that arrangement. And again, the key point is that the enjoyment by them of access to elements of the Western rule of law in those systems was a compensation for them, provided the security and stability that they had lost once Putin reasserted control in the early 2000s. In effect, those arrangements helped stabilize Putin's political economy by enabling the oligarchs to reconcile themselves to the now more subordinate position that they held in Russia. So, if one thinks that's broadly right, I think it's harder to see how welcoming the oligarchs back in they wouldn't fracture, they wouldn't choose sides. They'd remain loyal in Russia, happily so, because the things that they can't use and enjoy in Russia, they can get in the West once again. Second question about sanctions. Yes, so I made the point early on that the sanctions have not been designed to hurt a large number of small people. They're beginning to affect a small number of big people, so to speak. That's the elite and the oligarch argument. Nonetheless, of course, there has been fallout at a mass level from the sanctions. It's hard in practice to disentangle these from other external shocks, and particularly the fall in the oil price after 2014. But if you take the sum of those, then it's quite clear we've seen a very significant decline in Putin's popularity, even since his re-election last March. And there are some polls that suggest that his popularity is now lower than at any point since Crimea. So Crimea is a kind of the sugar rush of popularity, shooting his popularity, his polling figures up to 80 to 90%. That is dissipating now. But more specifically on, as it were, the psychological effect of sanctions, some very interesting polling data from the Levada Center came out literally, I think, just a couple of weeks ago. And so the polling questions were specifically, how concerned are you about sanctions? How concerned are you about international isolation? And what we've seen, even since 2018, is a very, very significant increase in that. So a year ago, 29% of people were saying, yes, I'm concerned about sanctions, yes, I'm concerned about international isolation. Now it's around 47-48%. Very, very significant change. And since that, the question was not about how well off you are, but specifically about the consequences, political consequences of sanctions, that suggests to me that there is this deep worry. So we're seeing worry about sanctions that were spreading across different parts of the Russian system, among the elites, among the various state actors I quoted earlier on, but at a mass level as well.
Charlie Reeve, Foreign Office Senator.
Oh, very good.
Deripaska's managed to have sanctions lifted on Rusal and some of his other companies. Of course, you can debate how much he will or won't benefit personally from that. But what message do you think the oligarchs will take from a pretty successful campaign that he's fought to get those sanctions lifted?
There are different views on this. I'm aware of the strength of the criticism of the lifting. I mean, let's be clear, this is the lifting on 3 companies, the 2 most important, which are EN Plus and Rusal. Not on his other companies, and not on him personally. He remains an SDN, designated national. I think that to understand the implications of this, the place to start would be the letter that OFAC wrote to the Senate on the 19th of December last year. So the 8-page document, formidable, documenting of the extent of the restrictions that continue to be applied to Deripaska and the enforcement measures for this, at that time still proposed agreement. They were very, very significant, and there's no substitute to reading it all, but in essence, as I would interpret it, the new agreement lifting these sanctions, in effect, has given the US Treasury the power to bring about a major restructuring of the assets and of the governance arrangements of an enormous non-American company. It's a formidable extension, if you like, of American financial powers, the second largest aluminium producer in the world. Why were they lifted? Because of the disruption that those sanctions, when they first applied, caused global aluminium markets. The pain and upset and anxiety that produced among key American allies, including allies in respect of the imposition of sanctions, especially Germany. Very, very important to maintain as unified a stand as possible. I think one of the unexpected achievements of Western policy up to now, unexpected I think by Russia too, is the strength and unity of purpose. It's easy to imagine how you'd see a trickling of defections among some EU member states. And that really is not happening. And indeed, I could say this to you, the brilliance of Britain's post-Salisbury diplomacy, despite Brexit, and despite the ambiguities of transatlantic relationship, in marshalling this truly international, it went beyond even the West, of course, coordination of responses, which is the massive coordinated expulsion of around 150 Russian diplomats, brilliantly done, actually. So it's very important that sanctions do not have unintended and undesired consequences. So I tend to the view that, yes, the headline figure, Deripaska's major companies no longer under sanction. Good for Deripaska, good for Putin, bad for sanctions. I think a finer grained view that really understands the details involved and the severity of the conditions attached would make one a little more optimistic. And also, incidentally, again, in this OFAC document, the US Treasury reserves to itself the right at any time to reimpose these sanctions if it feels it's a judge and jury and potentially, again, executioner. I think as interesting as any part of this story is the fact that it illustrates to Russia, but also to anyone else watching, potentially China, just how much financial power the United States can wield through its sanctions.
Rudolf Hauser, retired economist. On a broader question, since our objective is really to try to get Russia to modify its behavior in so many aspects, as you mentioned, including interference in elections and the like, not only what they're doing currently, but what they might do in the future. What sanctions modifications would you see that you would recommend to bring some of that about? Or can any sanctions bring that about? And if it comes to the question of creating enough disruption that Putin might be forced for power, would that necessarily be better or worse in terms of what would follow? And with regard to secondary sanctions that we use, to what extent is that making countries that we want as allies resentful and hurting our potential relations with them?
Again, some very good questions. So take up that last question first about secondary sanctions. Yes, and again, this, I would say, illustrates this broader point about how much power the United States is demonstrating. De Gaulle used to talk about the, what do you call it, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, yes, and it's in effect being manifested in reforms. Secondary sanctions, yes, they have to be used carefully. Like all these sanctions, there's the risk that over the longer term they incentivize countries, not just Russia, but other potential sanctions targets, incentivize them to find clever new ways around. Yes. Russia has been from time to time talking about using Bitcoin, for example, to do sanctions. Maybe working with Venezuela, for example, to do that. And that's why, off topic for me, and others may know more about this, that's one of the reasons I'm concerned about the Iranian sanctions. Because here, as I understand it, just again following the news on this, you have some of America's closest partners at least discussing ways to evade secondary sanctions. And if they found a way to do that, in the Iranian case, there's no way, there's nothing to stop other countries doing that with respect to the Russian case. So there's something very, very problematic there. But the thrust of your question reminds us that sanctions are always, work best when they are applied by many like-minded countries. So, and to me, that's the logic and the rationality of lifting the restrictions on Rusal and EN+. The whole question of Nord Stream 2 is also very difficult in this respect. An overuse of secondary sanctions. They've been tolerated so far by America's allies, but one would want to avoid a situation in which the excessive or promiscuous use of secondary sanctions caused a disillusionment. Yes, those sanctions need to be smart, both with respect to their targets, but also with respect to the collateral damage and the fallout. Your first question there about I wouldn't be sitting here if I knew what sanctions would bring about change. I think increasingly I'm not sure people are explicit about this, but the logic, the direction of the logic of the application of sanctions and the discourse of sanctions is that ultimately sanctions to work will need, maybe, and may be controversial, may need to be directed not to bring about Russian policy change, but Russian change. That they may be one of the elements that will induce or incentivize key actors in Russia to bring about a change. I don't call it regime change, that's a very sort of loaded and pregnant term, but evolution in the underlying ways that policy is made, rather than specifics of policy actions. Again, Russia is an unprecedentedly difficult target, more internationally integrated and larger by respect to relative economic size than any previous sanctions target. There is evidence, and again it's a matter of interpretation, that some will dispute, that at certain crucial moments, at the height of the fighting in eastern Ukraine in 2015, the prospect of much more severe sanctions, for example the SWIFT financial system, gave Russia reason to pause. It was poised, for example, to seize Mariupol and didn't. So if one looks at the flow of quite specific events on the ground, at least as an argument that Russia was forced to think twice. In that respect, it was the credible prospect of future sanctions, rather than the existing sanctions that have already been applied. But of course, it's the application of current sanctions which makes the future prospect of more severe sanctions credible. Yes, so with that link too. What would follow Putin? That's a much broader discussion. My mouth was watering when I saw the future series of events you are holding here in the next month or two, and I wish I could be around. You have an intriguing one, very arresting title. Is it Thugocracy? Is that coming? Yeah, I mean, wow, I wish I could come to that. So this will be as it were, a kind of a meta question, I suppose, for all of these events. Yes, what might follow after Putin? Could it be worse, in the sense of more adversarial towards the West? That's maybe the intent of the question. What would that look like? I don't know. What would worse look like? It's not just, I mean, the thing really to worry, again, this is much broader than sanctions, really to worry, I think, about some of the current drift and direction and rhetoric of Russian foreign policy. It's not only things that have been done, but the thing that really scares the West is the looseness of nuclear talk that we've seen over the last year or two, to an extent that we never saw during the Cold War. There was always a kind of, even in the most adversarial times of the crises of the Cold War, always a care and discipline and applying that. So if you think about the worst things that might happen, or the things really to keep one awake at night, that's something to focus on. Never say never, but I don't hardly to see anything worse or more in those sorts of respects. And again, the clamour, the demands, to the extent that we can follow these at a mass level, or even among some of the elites, I don't see people, any significant body of opinion, calling for more and harder against the West. I think the preponderance of alternatives that are proposed are different from that. Again, the growing alarm of international isolation implies you want less international isolation in the future. So, no, I think this is a regime that's becoming increasingly isolated, and that alternatives would wish to step away from the deleterious consequences of its policies, not do them more or more intensely. That's my sense. Josh?
Yeah, so two questions. One is a very specific one, which is, I'm curious as to whether anyone blames Putin for the sanctions in the sense of incompetence, right? That they ran a sort of bungling attempt to interfere in the U.S. 2016 election, that they got caught, and that, they were very close to getting the sanctions lifted, and that, by getting caught, they've gotten put in a situation now where these sanctions, as you say, seem like they're going to go on forever.
Yeah.
Does Putin get any blame at the mass level? Doesn't seem to be the case, right? It seems to be the case that when Putin gets blamed for at the mass level is when you mess with pensions or something like that. But what about in these oligarchic circles? There's such a myth in the West of Putin being the puppet master who does everything perfectly. I'm just wondering if those closer to him, what they think about 2016 from the perspective of the sanctions. Because a case could be made that the Russian interference in the election had absolutely nothing to do with the result of the election, and Donald Trump would have won, and if it hadn't been for the breaking Russian interference story, he would have lifted the sanctions anyway, right, for other reasons. So that's the first question. The second, more general question, I'm just really taken by listening, and I apologize for missing the beginning of the talk to keep gotten on this, but I'm really taken by your sort of four scenarios at the end, and the point you were making about how unusual it is to have the super rich not be able to influence policy. And I wonder if from that perspective, this fascination with Russian scholars, with and the press and everybody, with the oligarchs, might actually be a bit of a red herring. That we have this idea of who the oligarchs are. They come out of the 1990s. This is a very specific kind of concept and idea of who these people are. And yet there continues to be a massive redistribution of wealth under Putin. Some going to people who are traditionally considered oligarchs, but others going to people who are, as you mentioned, Siloviki or other things. And if our sort of fascination with this term is in some ways missing the fact that there is a very wealthy class of people in Russia who do have the government acting in their interests, you know, the vast majority of the time, but it's just not who we traditionally think of as the oligarchs. So I guess the sort of provocative question is the term and the analytical vantage point implied by it, oligarchs, losing some of its bite in the Russian context these days and helping us to understand Russian politics? And is it possibly getting in the way of understanding, leading to these kind of questions like, oh, there's a super rich elite that's not being influential in policy. Well, there's probably a super rich elite that is being influential in policy. Are we somehow missing this with the oligarchy focus?
They're excellent questions, and they anticipate the further direction of my research. So invite me back next year. But very briefly, what I can say for now is that on the matter of blaming Putin specifically, I haven't seen or heard this explicitly or publicly. People are still reluctant, as a mass level, you say an oligarch level, mass level, reluctant to, beyond fairly limited circles, explicitly to blame Putin for things. They're blaming conditions their unhappiness, and they're blaming policies, various buying pensions is sort of the ideal case, of course. But Putin himself, that hasn't happened yet. Does that mean they're not thinking it? That's a much harder question to access. I'm struck, though, it doesn't go as far as this, I'm struck by how even some hitherto docile, friendly papers like Kompravda and so on they're now expressing in their pages disquiet and unhappiness, and even elements of sarcasm. The last sort of end of year scripted, you know, the Q&A that Putin did, there were quite sort of wry comments about this sort of pointless choreographed exercise. I thought that was quite interesting. Oligarchs, yes, they'll be even more careful in their choice of words. So, but even there, so look, what happened when Belarus in the presidential administration announced or proposed the super profits tax on high commodity prices. Then you have Yeltsin, who's the wealthiest of them all. I mean, he's literally number one on the oligarch list, publicly criticizing senior official in presidential administration. So again, he's not blaming for sanctions, but there's something interesting and more explicit than I've heard articulated before. He's felt bold enough to be able to do that. And it wasn't a deputy minister who's criticizing, it was someone clearly authorized by Putin to propose this policy. Very interesting there. Again, in terms of my future research, so I'm going to be spending sort of part of the spring in Oxford at the Russian-Eurasian Centre there. There are a lot of oligarchs in London who will pass through. So I'm going to try and talk to some of them. So again, if I get back, I'll tell you what I found. The second, oligarchs. Yes, it's a great question. And so what I said at the beginning was that oligarchs is a convenient but imperfect term of art, of course. A controversial term even when it was coined. If oligarchs are defined in any system where that term is used as those who are very wealthy who influence policy, then essentially play a decisive role in governance, and that begs the question of what they really are and whether that is an appropriate term in Russia or might be in the future. elite, okay, a more neutral term. So if, let's supposing Russia is an outlier in the sense that those with enormous private wealth cannot influence decisions or have their interests overridden. Are they an elite properly so called? The whole discourse of elites, going back to its early 20th century coining and Moscow and Pareto and so on, and then C. Wright Mills after the Second World War, an elite is someone who matters very, very much. If they're wealthy but they can't do anything with that wealth, are they no longer an elite so called? Again, that would be an exceptional position for a country to find itself in. Are they, in fact, think of it in Russian terms rather than comparative terms, are they a modern service nobility? Yes, that's the patrimonial traditions. But are there those who are wealthy, also wealthy, but have acquired their wealth through different means, through direct access to or occupancy of state roles? Are there people who are the ones in whose interest the country is really run? Yes, possibly. And that may be, again, I gave some reasons at the end there why it might be argued that, no, the oligarchs, the private oligarchs, can't matter. They're simply outcompeted or outweighed. They're less important than these other emerging interests of the state or those directly tied to the state, the Siloviki or the Silovarks, to sort of make the connection between power and wealth explicit. Possibly. Again, that's an essential research question, and that's the next stage I really want to explore. And what is the relationship between them? Supposing oligarchs, if you can still call them that, wish to be agents of change, can they do that on their own, even if they're working together? Will they not need to make alliances, establish relationships of some kind, to work in concert with others who also may feel, however they gain their wealth, that they are also threatened by the direction of travel? Who knows? So I'm afraid questions without answers, but it's a great question. It's one I intend to pursue myself.
All right, so I think we're running out of time, so let's just thank Nigel for the presentation and answers to the question.
Okay. Thank you for your question.